Hello, Brobs. I'm back with So the Witch Won't Eat Me. Fantasy and the Child's Fear of Infanticide, which sounds absolutely insane, but here we are. I have my four beer vessel, which is only half filled, a candle, and it's my child's birthday, so here we are with I believe it's the foreword. No, it's the introduction. Fantasy and the Child's Fear of Infanticide. If anyone had suggested when I started my psychoanalytic practice some 25 years ago that my patients would fear that I or their parents might kill them, I think I might have responded with shock. I might even have rejected it as somebody's nightmare. That the fear of infanticide might be their central preoccupation. Absurd. As one child after another admitted me to this world of fantasy. Pardon. I thought they were saying that admitted to me, but admitted me to his world of fantasy. However, I witnessed the terror of being killed that varied only in its intensity. Although frequently it was deeply buried in the unconscious of my adult patients, I discovered that in children it was usually right on the surface. Have some more beer. Hold on, I think I will. Get this candle away so it doesn't warm it up. Yeah, if you came here expecting some kind of Shakespearean reading of this, you're going to be sadly mistaken. After frequently, although frequent, I don't even know where I'm at this point. I witnessed terror of being killed that varied only in its intensity, although frequently it was deeply buried in the unconscious of my adult patients. I discovered that in children, it was usually right on the surface. Almost invariably, they informed me very often during their first session of what they experienced as the precariousness of their lives. One 4.5-year-old, whose terror I came to know in much greater detail, solemnly announced that her drawings were entitled Danger City and Danger Sky. A 6-year-old was too preoccupied with watching the clouds in fear of their crashing to engage in play. Another 5-year-old, white-faced and unsmiling, confided that he had two pencils in his eyes that, whenever needed, could come out and shoot. When I casually commented to another 6-year-old that I had noticed he always made sure we were seated at the table, but on opposite sides, he responded with a hysterical laugh. So the witch won't eat me. Until I started treating children, my understanding of fantasy did not go much beyond its wish-fulfilling aspects. Usually we think of fantasy as an indulgence of the imagination. The mere mention of the term frequently conjures up recollected pleasures or anticipated delights. To transcend the boredom of the moment and enter a world of voluptuous enchantment, to shed our limitations and put on a mantle of infinite power. All this we familiarly associate with fantasy. Our concept coincides with Freud's characterization of it as imaginary gratifications of ambitious, grandiose, erotic wishes, a kind of nature park where everything may grow and spread as it pleases. The nature park I encountered in my treatment of the children, whom I discuss in the following chapters, had little to do with either erotic wishes or pleasure. It abounded in beasts of terrifying mien, and cruel witches and monsters who pursued their victims with unrelenting savagery. In those preserves, the air continually vibrated to the rat-a-tat-tat of machine guns. Corpses hung from trees and streams ran red with blood. Do you want to help me run? The monster is after us was the way 3.5-year-old Ellie introduced the fantasy that lasted more than a year. A 4.5-year-old continually informed me that the robber is trying to knock over the Empire State Building. I was instructed by a 5-year-old in the slaughter of multitudes by a carefully worked out routine that inevitably ended with our dumping the imaginary corpses over the roof and then brushing the blood and dirt off our hands. I have spent many a session being shot to death and then revived, only so that I might be shot again. In almost every instance, the fantasy represented the child's attempt to defend himself against the early terror of being killed. Perhaps no one has described more graphically the terror that invests children's fantasies than Melanie Klein, one of the first child analysts, who wrote, "We get to look upon the child's fear of being devoured or cut up or torn to pieces, or its terror of being surrounded and pursued by menacing figures as a regular component of its mental life." So was also clear about the source of that terror and went on to say, she was also clear about that source. Let me start again. She was also clear about the source of that terror and went on to say, "I have no doubt from my own analytic observations that the identities behind these imaginary terrifying figures are the child's own parents, and that those dreadful shapes in some way or other reflect the features of its father and mother, however distorted and fantastic the resemblance may be." The implications of the terror in those fantasies were apparently as difficult for her to confront and to define in explicit terms in the 30s as they have continued to be, with only slight modification. In our own time, sorry, that was bad pause and end of a sentence. The question that followed her description still reverberates. How does it come about that the child creates such a fantastic image of its parents, an image so far removed from reality? Well, I'm going to give you a little insight from the armchair psychologist. If a 4-year-old's in therapy, usually their parents are causing their distress. Not always, but usually. So, I mean, let's be honest. Let's be honest. When I first tackled that question, like many beginning analysts, I focused on the parents. What kind of monsters were they? Although I came to understand the tensions and the pressures that very often determined their emotional state, it was only when I shifted my focus to the child himself that I found the answer. The first break came in response to two patients who were convinced not only that their parents wanted to kill them, but they actually would. When I examined the factors, they produced such an impression, I discovered that in both instances they had been exposed to more than the usual degree of threat. Nevertheless, it was clear they were in no danger. Their unshakable belief that their lives were at stake, however, led me to study the range of fear that children expressed in their fantasies and to weigh the reasons that might account for the differences. I concluded that children are universally predisposed to the fear of infanticide by both their physical and their psychological stage of development, and that the intensity of that fear depends on the incidence of traumatic events and on the degree of violence and of love they have experienced. Once I arrived at that concept, nothing could have seemed more obvious. Why hadn't it occurred to me sooner? When I suggested it to other adults, they also expressed surprise but immediate acceptance. Why shouldn't children be afraid of being killed? To begin with, consider their size. Is there anyone more killable? To be born tiny and defenseless in a world where even a mouse has the advantage of mobility is surely to find oneself at the mercy of every living being. That adults seem to have banished from consciousness the thought that children know this and are often preoccupied by their fears may simply reflect their need for a continuing state of amnesia concerning their own childhood. Otherwise, they could not escape the conclusion, readily derived from even cursory observation, that children are soon aware of their vulnerability and their dependence on the goodwill of their parents for their very lives, that the resulting terror may become a central factor in the defenses they design in order to achieve a feeling of safety emerges with startling clarity from an investigation of those defenses. The child's size not only exposes him to attack, however, it also determines what he is capable of absorbing from the outside world. Although by now we have a more or less accurate picture of a child's physical requirements, we are less knowledgeable when it comes to his emotional capacity. Pardon. Contrary to the claims of those who defend the current programming on television, whether the child is the recipient or merely a witness, he has a limited ability to accommodate violence or violent feelings. An equally serious liability is the kind of thinking with which the child emerges from infancy. The term magical has been used to describe it and reflects the child's impression that his thoughts, wishes, and feelings are endowed with a mysterious power. Since as an infant he apparently activates the seeming giants of his environment without the use of speech, how else explain the remarkable and frequently unsolicited accommodation of his needs? The concept that he equates thoughts, wishes, and feelings with deeds is corroborated not only by the functioning of the young children whom I have treated, but by the always startling assumption of many of my adult patients that I know their thoughts and wishes without their having to verbalize them. In those instances where the illusion of magical powers is naturally dissipated by reality and by experiences involving a normal setting of limits, and where his world remains relatively stable, unmarred by traumatic events or by excessive frustrations or quantities of rage, he may escape comparatively unharmed. Unfortunately, that is rarely the case. His feelings of omnipotence may be reinforced both by a failure to set limits or by inordinate repression and by an imbalance in the familial relationships, where the parent of the same sex is frequently or permanently absent, and where the child feels preferred by one parent to the other siblings. He may develop a distorted concept of his powers and of his relationship to the world. It would be difficult to measure the dangerous consequences of the child's resulting confusion. His feelings of omnipotence may lead him to expect deeds to materialize effortlessly, or he may inhibit activity in order to avoid exposing his limitations and risking failure. He may also renounce realistic goals for grandiose schemes that may unconsciously be designed to establish his absolute control. As I lose control of this camera, the inevitable disappointments may produce profound dissatisfaction with the self and stifle creativity or involve him in ever-expanding achievement that rarely satisfies his unconscious objectives. With his concept of the magical nature of his thoughts, wishes, and feelings, he may also assume responsibility for an extraordinary range of unhappy events. Is there a death in the family? He's a murderer. An accident? He's the secret perpetrator. An illness? He's the agent. His badness causes his mother to leave him for a job or even to want another child and drives his father to absent himself on business trips. The child may automatically feel he is the subject of every quarrel and the author of every disaster, whether it is estrangement of the parents or separation or divorce. The igniting element in his hazardous predisposition for guilt, with its accompanying expectation of punishment, appears to be the child's own feelings of rage. His aggressive feelings are forbidden not only because his parents may condemn them, but because of the devastating power with which the child invests them. If to think and to feel and to wish is to also act, the child may understandably measure the magnitude of the threat he thinks he represents by the intensity of the destructive character of his inner world. The angrier he is, the more dangerous he may think he is, and the greater may be his fear of retribution. He imputes such powers both to his own and his parents' feelings. Where the parents are persistently angry or where they act out their anger, he may fear the worst. That feelings are the child's major concern follows from his infantile experience, when they are the primary mode of communication, when words become the medium of exchange. It is reasonable to assume That, for him, their essential function may continue to be the transmission of feelings. The child listens to words as much to gauge their emotional as their informational content. In an ongoing process that involves the weighing of words and even deeds against the perception of feelings, it is frequently the perception that wins out, as adults know only too well. When we consider the child's vulnerability and the dangerous consequences of his magical thinking, it comes as no surprise that his greatest concern may be his life. A precocious 5-year-old put it very succinctly. Although it took a little while to unravel his problem, he finally made it clear that whenever his mother left him with a babysitter, he became worried. When I suggested that he might be worried that something might happen to his mother and she mightn't return, he assured me, "No, I'm worried for myself. What could I do if something happened to the babysitter?" I mean, he ain't wrong. Whether the fear of infanticide dominated the child's life or became a manageable element depended in large part, as I suggested earlier, on the incidence of traumatic events and on the degree of violence and of love he had absorbed from his familial environment. Violence or the threat of violence confirmed his already well established fears, even concealed but violent wishes, however, were sufficient for him to require a specific set of defenses in order to protect himself. Were these elements the only problem, the child's task would have been comparatively simple. His need for defenses was compounded, however, by his inevitably violent response to his parents' violence or violent wishes and feelings. For that response to take place, it did not appear necessary for the child himself to be the target. With the children whom I have treated, it was sufficient if the parents persistently committed violent acts of any kind or were frequently violent, not toward the child, but toward each other, or toward another child, or even toward an animal, or if they repeatedly permitted one child to act violently toward a more defenseless one with impunity. In some instances, violent and habitually attacking older siblings were experienced as agents of the parents. Where the parents didn't intervene effectively to protect the child, he assumed they wanted him killed. When he found the violence or the violent feelings he experienced within the family magnified, frequently beyond his wildest fears, on the television or the movie screen or on the city streets, his terror became intensified. The idea that children universally fear that their parents may kill them is a startling one. Yet I have found that it is far more acceptable than the possibility that parents may actually have such a wish. Until recently, the concept that parents may want to kill their children has been even more carefully buried than the thought that the children may live in daily fear of it. Not only is the wish to kill one of the most deeply repressed feelings, but the general understanding of the nature of feelings is still the subject of considerable misconception. It is usually with a sense of shock, and very often only after a period of agonizing denial, that patients may gradually and reluctantly acknowledge that they not only hate, but that they want to kill those whom they hate. That such wishes are directed towards both the analyst and the people they love is an equally repugnant and frightening concept. For some patients, that fact is so loathsome that the discovery and identification of such wishes and feelings may precipitate suicidal thoughts. The prohibition that became a thundering commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," seems to have registered as "Thou shalt not want to kill," or even "Thou shalt not feel like killing." When we recognize that the magical thinking so characteristic of early childhood may persist into adulthood, it becomes evident that for many, acknowledging a wish to kill is tantamount to killing. A complication arising from the repression of such feelings and wishes is the resulting belief that feelings exist in a pure form. It frequently comes as a surprise to patients that contradictory feelings can exist side by side. In any analysis, the startling recognition that love does not exclude hate, nor hate love is a milestone on the road to maturity. When the question is not merely one of wanting to kill, but of wanting to kill one's child, however, we enter another dimension. The revulsion aroused by even the thought of such a possibility suggests the tragedy of parenthood. Most parents embark on their new role with love and high aspirations, inspired in many instances by a determination to correct their own parents' errors, to make up for their shortcomings. That their education has scarcely been designed to make the undertaking a success may partly explain the high incidence of failure. No matter how extensive their schooling, few people have received the tools for understanding either their own feelings or their children's. Their expectation that they will succeed where their parents failed is therefore frequently doomed to disappointment. Further, their assumption of personal responsibility for what very often appears to be a mystifying transformation of love into hate compounds the problem by generating an almost intolerable burden of guilt. Although many years have passed since Freud established the importance of infantile experience and its persistent influence on the adult personality, one of the most painful realizations to emerge in many analyses is the patient's recognition that, as much as he would like to disown it, he has been affected by his past and is a product of his upbringing. How damaging the denial of this truth may be is demonstrated by the frequent anticipation of parents that no matter what traumas they may have lived through, they are expected and they themselves expect to raise perfect children. Few parents grant themselves the right to their own problems or forgive themselves for the feelings they have absorbed from their parents. How difficult it has been to approach both the child's fear of infanticide and the parent's wish for it may be measured by Freud's avoidance of the issue. Although he left room for the possibility that his theory of the Oedipus complex might eventually be superseded, he himself never abandoned the concept that it was the central cause of emotional problems. To understand why, we have to look no further than the theory itself. Many years ago, Dr. Hyman Spotnitz called my attention to Freud's phenomenal omission of the first part of the myth of Oedipus in formulating his theory. The Greek legend commences with the conspiracy of the parents of Oedipus to do away with him in order to defeat the prophecy of the oracle that when he grows up he will kill his father and marry his mother. It is their act of abandoning him on a hillside to die in order to circumvent the prediction that sets in motion the events that subsequently cause the prophecies fulfillment. In Freud's hands, this story underwent a dramatic transformation. His theory omitted the murderous act of the parents and focused on the deeds of Oedipus. It treated the murder of his father and the marriage to his mother as universal drives, isolating them as inevitable stages in a child's development. Had Freud applied the same principle of inevitability to the entire myth, his theory would have established the link between cause and effect. The parents' wish to kill their child would then have been universalized as the inevitable first step in the Oedipus complex and as the precipitating factor in the child's preoccupation with incest and murder. When I first recognized this distortion in Freud's treatment of the myth, I was astounded by its implications and immediately suspected that it might reflect a need on Freud's part to exclude parental influence as a factor in the genesis of emotional problems. Although we have come some distance since Freud formulated his theories, our understanding of psychological phenomena is still rooted in his extraordinary discoveries. It would nevertheless be as much an error to deny his limitations as to magnify them. Freud's method provided us with an effective tool for understanding the self, but by the same token underscored the difficulty of arriving at such knowledge alone, only with the assistance and in the presence of another highly skilled individual who has undergone a similar process can the work be done. In light of the concept that the child's central preoccupation may be his fear of infanticide and his major investment in maintaining an idealized image of his parents, nothing could have been more predictable than that Freud should have ignored the roles of the parents in the story of Oedipus. I need a cameraman. Although, in his self analysis, he had the courage to confront the taboos of murder and incest and to expose himself for decades to the anathema that followed his theory that such wishes are universal. Apparently, the taboo of infanticide was too formidable for him to take on. We can assume he wore the same blinders most people use when they enter the labyrinth of emotional experience without the aid of a psychoanalyst, and that, like them, he needed to draw a magic circle around parents, that he was unable to approach the wish for infanticide or the child's fear of it may therefore have been a natural consequence of his being the first psychoanalyst.